Friends, today we will discuss United Nations Charter and Human Rights and the provisions under the United Nations Charter. Let us come down to the introduction part. The United Nations has created a global structure for protecting human rights based largely on its charter, non-binding declarations, legally binding treaties and on various activities aimed at advancing democracy and human rights throughout the world. The first documentary use of the expression human rights is to be found in the Charter of the United Nations, which was adopted after the Second World War at the San Francisco on 25th June 1945. And it was ratified by a majority of its signatories in October that year. The United Nations system of human rights protection has three main components. First, it establishes international standards through its charter, legally binding treaties, non-binding declarations, agreements and documents. Next, it mandates special rapporteurs and experts and groups such as working groups, committees and treaty bodies to work in various manners for the promotion and protection of human rights. Finally, it offers technical assistance through the Voluntary Fund for Advisory Services and technical assistance in the field of human rights. Let us see now the birth and development of human rights. Wars, revolutions and upheavals always have been significant forces in the history of human rights, now often called international humanitarian laws, and in this regard the experience of World War I from 1914 to 1918 certainly proved to be no exceptions. It was with the birth of United Nations that the human rights movement got a momentum in the international sphere. These rights were no longer to be confined to the rights of the minorities. There dawned the age of universal human rights such as the right of life, liberty and equality, which were to be available to all human beings wherever they resided. Peace conferences have also been important to the historical evolution of human rights. War tears down certain power structures and sources if resistant from the past and thereby create new opportunities for dialogue and change, generate wartime promises and produce a desire for peace and a better world. All of these factors came into play at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 when it began to be argued that there cannot be peace unless there is security, and that one cannot have security unless there is justice, and that finally one cannot have justice unless one has respect for human rights. Now, let us see World War II and beginning of human rights revolution. The impact of violence and war on the history of human rights was once again revealed during the course of World War II. Most notable were the consequences that came from two sources: the grand promises made to advance rights and the horrific actions that greatly abused rights. The long and painful experiences of World War II and the brutal assaults on the human rights that characterized it, as well as the promises made during the course of war, heavily influenced those called upon to establish peace and security on a more enduring foundation once the war was over. This could be seen in the efforts made by those who created the United Nations and who set into motions that would constitute a revolution in the history of human rights. Coming down to the establishment of United Nations Charter, the failure of the League of Nations on one hand and the horror and reckless destruction caused by World War II on the other hand disturbed many minds, especially in allied countries. The desire was expressed to establish peace even when the war was in progress. In order to achieve it, frantic efforts to create an international organization had begun as early as in 1941. Deliberations became intense after the termination of the war, which resulted in the creation of the United Nations organization on 24th October 1945. The United Nations was therefore founded in the ashes of a war that brought untold sorrow to mankind. Let us see a brief account of the important events leading to the establishment of the United Nations. Firstly, the Declaration of St. James Palace in 1941. On 12 June 1941, the representatives of the Great Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the Union of South Africa and of exile governments of Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Greece, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Yugoslavia and General de Gaulle of France met at the ancient St. James Palace and signed a declaration commonly known as London Declaration. The declaration inter alia stated the only true basis of enduring peace is the willing cooperation of free people in a world in which, relieved of menace of aggression, all may enjoy economic and social security. It is our intention to work together and with other free people both in war and peace to this end. This was the first step towards the creation of a world organization. Coming down to the Atlantic Charter 1941, the American President Roosevelt and the British Prime Minister Churchill in August 1941 met somewhere at sea, which resulted in the issue of a joint declaration destined to be known in history as the Atlantic Charter of 14th August 1941. The charter was neither a treaty between the two powers nor was it final and formal expression of peace aims. It was only an affirmation of certain common principles in the national policies of their respective countries on which they based their hopes for a better future for the world. Support for the principles of the Atlantic Charter and a pledge of cooperation to the utmost in giving effect to them came from a meeting of 10 governments in London shortly after Churchill returned from his ocean rendezvous. Then United Nations Declaration in 1942, the next important event took place on 1st January 1942 when President Roosevelt of America, Prime Minister Churchill of Britain, Maxim Litino of USSR and T.V. Soong of China signed a short document which later came to be known as the United Nations Declaration. The term United Nations was suggested by President Roosevelt, and the next day the representative of 22 other nations added their signatures. Later on, 21 states also adhered to this declaration. The complete alliance was effected in the declaration in the light of the principles of the Atlantic Charter, which stated in the first clause of the United Nations Declaration that the signatory nations had subscribed to a common program of purposes and principles embodied in the joint declaration of the President of the United States of America and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland dated August 14, 1941, which was known as the Atlantic Charter. Then it was Moscow Declaration in 1943. Thus, by 1943, all the principal allied nations were committed to outright victory and therefore an attempt to create a world in which men in all lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear and want. But the basis for a world organization had yet to be defined. Such a definition came at the meeting of the foreign ministers of Great Britain, the United States and the Soviet Union in October 1943. On October 30th, the Moscow Declaration was signed by them along with the Chinese ambassador to the Soviet Union, which under clause 4 proclaimed that They recognized the necessity of establishing at the earliest practicable date a general international organization based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all peace-loving states and opened to membership by all such states, large and small, for the maintenance of international peace and security. The Moscow Declaration was important in the sense that it stressed for the need for an international organization, and it also stated some basic principles and objects such as principle of sovereign equality of all peace-loving states and the maintenance of international peace and security. On 1st December 1943, Roosevelt, Stalin and Churchill met at Tehran, declared that they had worked out concerted plans for final victory. As to peace, the declaration read, "We are sure that our concord will win an enduring peace. We recognize fully the supreme responsibility resting upon us and all the United Nations to make a peace which will command the goodwill of the overwhelming masses of the people of the world and banish the scourge and terror of war for many generations." Then it was Dumbarton Oaks Conference in 1944. In order to prepare the blueprint of the principles laid down in Atlantic Charter, the Moscow and Tehran declarations, the representatives of Great Britain, USSR, China and the United States made a private mansion at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. The discussions completed on 7th October 1944 and a proposal for the structure of the World Organization was submitted by the four powers to all the United Nations governments and to the people of all countries for their study and discussion. According to the Dumbarton Oaks proposals, the organization to be known as the United Nations shall have four principal bodies. They shall be General Assembly, Security Council, the National Court of Justice and a Secretariat. An Economic and Social Council working under the authority of the General Assembly was also provided for. The essence of the plan was that responsibility for preventing future war should be conferred upon to the Security Council. However, the method of voting in the Security Council was left open for the future discussion. Then it was Yalta Conference. The question of voting procedure in the Security Council was taken up at the Yalta, where Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin together with their foreign ministers and chief of staffs met in the conference on 11th February 1945. The conference announced that the question has been resolved. The agreement provided that all decisions on questions of procedure should be taken by a majority of 7 votes and that decisions on other questions should be taken by a like majority with the added requirements of unanimity of the permanent members. It was provided, however, that a party to a dispute should abstain from voting in certain matters. At the end of the conference, it was announced that the 3 governments had agreed to call a conference of the United Nations to meet at San Francisco on 25th April 1945. To prepare the charter of such an organization along the lines proposed in the informal conversations at Dumbarton Oaks. Later on, the government of China also agreed to become a sponsor to the conference. It was provided, however, that a party to a dispute should abstain from voting in certain matters. At the end of the conference, it was announced that the 3 governments had agreed to call a conference of the United Nations to meet at San Francisco on 25th April 1945 to prepare the charter of such an organization along the lines proposed in the informal conversations at the Dumbarton Oaks. Later on, the government of China also agreed to become a sponsor of the conference. The provisional government of France, however, declared to become one of the sponsoring governments. Then it was San Francisco Conference in 1945. At the San Francisco Conference, officially known as the United Nations Conference on International Organization, consisting of delegates of 50 nations, it was expressed by several delegates that the United Nations should establish an International Bill of Rights. Although this could not be done, it was well realized by the members that it should be the obligation of the international community to cooperate in eradicating the scourge of war, and they were therefore determined that the promotion and respect for human rights, which at present constitute so important and so conspicuous, be an integrated part of the United Nations Charter. In the last session of the conference on 26 June 1945, the charter was passed unanimously and was signed by all the 50 representatives on 26 June 1945. The United Nations came into existence on 24 October 1945 upon ratification of the charter by 29 of the signatories, including the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. The United Nations did not come into existence at the time of the signing of the charter. In many countries, the charter was required to be approved by the congresses or parliaments. It was therefore provided that the charter would come into force when the governments of China, France, Great Britain, the Soviet Union and the United States and the majority of other signatory states shall ratify it and shall deposit notification to this effect with the State Department of United States. The United Nations came into existence on October 24, 1945 upon ratification of the charter by 29 of the signatories, including the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. It is to be noted that the name of the organization United Nations was taken from the Declaration of the United Nations and adopted in tribute of the memory of Roosevelt, who suggested it. Now, let us see the main bodies of the United Nations. The United Nations is composed of 6 principal organs: the General Assembly, the Secretariat, the Security Council, the International Court of Justice, the Trusteeship Council and the Economic and Social Council. Now, coming down to the purpose of the United Nations, the purposes for which the United Nations was established are laid down in first article of the Charter. They are to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations among nations, to achieve international cooperation, to make the United Nations an international forum for harmonization. Let us come down to the preamble of the United Nations. The Charter's preamble states the purpose in founding the United Nations. That is, we the people of the United Nations determined to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small. The Charter itself includes the following goals, that is, to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural or humanitarian character, and in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex or religion and so on. The preamble of the United Nations is preceded by the words Charter of the United Nations. It indicates the title of that legal instrument and the name of the organization constituted by it. The Charter is a multilateral treaty, albeit a treaty having certain special characteristics. The preamble of the United Nations Charter has set forth the basic aims of the United Nations, which are to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, to establish justice and respect for international obligations, to promote social progress and better standards of life. The preamble also affirms that in order to achieve these ends, the peoples of the United Nations are determined to practice tolerance, to live in peace as good neighbors, to unite, maintain peace and security, to ensure that armed forces shall not be used except in the common interest, and to employ international machinery for the social and economic betterment of all people. Let us see the provisions under the United Nations Charter that promotes human rights. The Charter of the United Nations contained a number of provisions for the promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the Preamble, and in Article 1, 13 Clause 1 Subclause B, Article 55, 56, Article 62 Clause 2, Article 68 and Article 76 Clause C. As is well known, the Charter of United Nations contains number of references to the promotion of human rights. Article 1, the purposes of the United Nations are to maintain international peace and security, and to that end to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of the peace, and to bring about by peaceful means and in conformity with the principles of justice and international law, adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to breach of peace, to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of people, and to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace, to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural or humanitarian character, and in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex or religion, etc., and to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations in the attainment of these common ends. Article 1 of the Charter also lays down the purposes of the United Nations. Accordingly, it is one of the duties of the United Nations as a world body to take necessary steps to achieve international cooperation in order to reduce the inequalities for economic, social and cultural aspects. Para 3 of Article 1 of the Charter provided that the achievement of international cooperation in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex or religion shall be one of the purposes of the United Nations. The above provision shows that the desirability of promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms without distinction as to race, sex or religion was generally recognized. Article 8 lays down that the United Nations shall place no restriction on the eligibility of men and women to participate in any capacity in its principal and subsidiary organs. According to the provisions of this article, all the persons of the world are eligible to join the United Nations and serve in its jobs as per the qualifications prescribed for each post. The jobs, the internships and various projects that are available with United Nations are open to all without any discrimination on the grounds of race, sex or any other ground. Then it is Article 13 wherein the General Assembly shall initiate studies and make recommendations for the purpose of promoting international cooperation in the political field and encouraging the progressive development of international law and its codification, promoting international cooperation in the economic, social, cultural, educational and health fields, and assisting in the realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex or religion. The further responsibilities, functions and powers of the General Assembly with respect to matters mentioned in paragraph 1, clause B are set forth in chapter 9 and 10. Coming down to article 55, with a view to the creation of conditions of stability and well-being which are necessary for peaceful and friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of people, the United Nations shall promote higher standards of living, full employment and conditions of economic and social progress and development, solutions of international economic, social, health and related problems, and international cultural and educational cooperation, and universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex or religion. According to this article, it is the responsibility of the United Nations to take all necessary legal steps to promote peace and cooperation between the member countries to attain higher standards of living, full employment and the promotion of economic and social progress, to suggest solutions to help the states to achieve internationally economic, social, health, education and cultural relations of a high standard, and to promote universal respect for human rights without any discrimination on any ground whatsoever. Article 55 provided that the Charter of the United Nations shall promote a. higher standards of living, full employment and conditions of economic and social progress and development, b. solutions of international economic, social, health and related problems, and international cultural and educational cooperation, and c. universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex or religion. Now, let us see the state obligation under article 55 and article 56. As the constituent statute of an intergovernmental organization, United Nations Charter has the status of a multilateral treaty imposing on its state parties binding obligations under international law. One of those obligations expressly assumed in article 56 is in the form of a pledge, that is, the obligation to take joint and separate action to achieve the purpose set forth in article 55 clause C, that is, universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all. Article 56 provided that members of the United Nations pledge themselves to take joint and separate action in cooperation with the organization for the achievement of the purposes set forth in article 55. Further, article 62 of the Charter authorized the Economic and Social Council to make recommendation for the purpose of promoting respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all. Article 68 directed the Council to set up commissions in economic and social fields and for the promotion of human rights and such other commissions as may be required for the performance of its functions. The Commission of Human Rights and the Commission on the Status of Women are the subsidiary bodies of the Economic and Social Council. According to article 76, the member states establish a trusteeship council, that is the another principal organ. Para C of article 76 stipulated that one of the basic objectives of the trusteeship system is to encourage respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all, that is, without distinction as to race, sex or religion, and to encourage recognition of the interdependence of the people of the world. Let us conclude with that the efforts of the individual states led for the recognition of human rights in international law in 1945. The United Nations Charter adopted with an aim to protect and uplift the human rights of individuals at all times. The United Nations, in order to achieve these objectives, adopted a number of conventions, covenants, declarations and resolutions. It has created an international mechanism commissioned on human rights, which are presently referred as Human Rights Council and a High Commissioner for Human Rights, to oversee the activities of the state and to protect the rights of the individual. Apart from the United Nations, it is the duty of the nation states and we the people of the United Nations to practice the culture of human rights. It implies subtly that every one of us, that is individuals and states, both at the national and international scenario, need to discharge our duties at all times without any deviance. The strict adherence to human rights alone would end the agonies of the present day world and bring back the glory of respect to humanity and mankind. Only then it would be possible to claim liberty, equality, freedom of speech and expression the way they have been crafted to achieve the ideals of peace and security to mankind. Thank you.